Hi folks, and welcome to another episode of Quokka from Scratch, this training where I'm actually showing you how I built this Quokka application starting from nothing and building the entire thing out. Now today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about storing data to a database and reading data from a database. But before we do that, let's look at where we are. Now, where we are right now is this. We have created a Flask application called Quokka. We followed what was provided in the Flask tutorial and did everything that they said. We just changed the name of the application to Quokka. What I've done a little bit beyond that is I've created Python packages for controller data models and views because I know that I'll be using them. But we've only really touched two files. One of them is this init file, and the other one is this devices file from which we're going to be reading information about the devices that we'll be dealing with. And this is all the code that we've really written so far. And the result of that code is we have a RESTful API, and we're using this tool called Postman in order to send requests to our Flask service, which is Quokka, and to get back from it this information about the devices that are in the network. Now, the devices are just the ones that I've read in this particular import devices step. So they're not anything that I've done. I haven't done anything special with respect to the network, but I do have a RESTful API up and running. Now, if I was to run this right now, you would see that it's going to fail. And the reason it's going to fail is because I don't actually have Flask running at this time. So what I'm going to do is use my trusty terminal here. I'm going to put it up here. I'm going to go to the directory where Quokka is. I've put it into PyCharm projects, which is the default, and the name of my application is Quokka. And from here, I can technically just say Flask run, but there's one thing missing. I need to tell Flask what is the name of the application. And I do that by assigning an environment variable called Flask app to the name of my project, and we called it Quokka. So once I've exported that, then I can say Flask run, and Flask is going to come up and it says, okay, I'm listening on localhost on port 5000. And when we look at our Postman here, you can see we're going to localhost 5000. What about this extra part of the URL, this devices part? What is that? Well, when I look over here at Flask, I can see, oh, look at that. That matches exactly what I'm doing. This /devices, I'm getting back all of my devices. And so this is the only code that I've really had to do so far. And I've got reading from a file, importing it into a bunch of Python dictionaries and a list of these devices. And then I'm returning them just simply using this Python dictionary, and the devices, remember, is a list of devices. Those devices themselves are dictionaries, and this is what we see here. When I run this again, then I actually get the real life data out. Here's this devices piece, and as you can see, that matches this devices piece right there. I could have called it anything that I wanted to, but I called it devices so that it described what it was. And then here's a bracket. This is a JSON array, which is analogous to a Python dictionary. And then within it, there's these items, which are each going to be one particular device. And this is the information about the device. In JSON, we call these curly bracketed things objects. In Python, we of course call them a dictionary. They are key value pairs. The key is host name. The value is this actual host name. And these things are what I'm going to be using in order to access the device later on when we get to that part. So this is what we've done. One last thing before we close up this review is I just wanted to make sure that you're aware that when we started, I'm going to start a new terminal here so that I can show you. When we started, like the very first episode or the second, what we did was we built this VM, this Ubuntu VM, and then we loaded a whole bunch of software that we are using to make all of this magic happen. Remember, I wrote hardly any code. There's hardly any code here, and yet I have a web service with a RESTful API reading in from a file a list of devices with all of their attributes, and returning that information via an HTTP REST call. So that's a lot of stuff that's gone on. How did we get there? And so I'm just going to review a few of the things that we've done. Look at the first actual episode of this Quokka from scratch in order to remind yourself what we did. If you've gone along with me, then there's nothing new here. I'm going to use the history command in order to review what I've done, and I'm going to grep for sudo apt because those are my sudo apt install things. You can see this GCC make and Perl I did in order to get my VM, my Ubuntu running correctly. Here I installed pip. Here I installed Node.js and npm. Those are the things that are going to make the user interface work. We're not using those yet. I'm also storing things and retrieving things from Git, so I'm actually doing that. Here I'm doing stuff with Chrome. If you recall, I went through a couple of iterations to get Chrome exactly where it needed to be in order to install it correctly. Now let's look at something else that we did. I'm going to do another history, and this time I'm going to grep for pip3. And when I look at pip3 stuff, you can see I installed Flask. We're actually using that. Flask SQL Alchemy, that's what we're going to be using for the database stuff, so we will be doing that. NetTools is something that we're using for dealing with IP addresses and stuff of that nature. SQLite, turns out, comes for free on Ubuntu 20, so I didn't actually have to install that. Tabulate is something I used in one of the training sessions, so I just went ahead and did that. We're not using that right now. We're also not using Python ARP table. Flask cores is what I use in order to let other hosts that are running the UI communicate with my Flask/Quokka RESTful web server that's running. So I need to do that. Napalm I'll be using when I talk to devices. NTP-lib I'll be using when I communicate with the services for NTP. And this one that looks kind of funny, I don't even know how to pronounce that, but that is for my Postgres, for doing database with Postgres stuff. And then let's see, I installed some things using Snap, which is a new way of doing it. I think I realized that Chrome wasn't available, so that didn't really work, but this one certainly did. I installed PyCharm using Snap and WebStorm. Well, that's for doing the UI stuff, JavaScript, etc. Postman, we're using that. For some reason, I installed and uninstalled Postman. I thought I had an error with it, and it was probably just my mistake. So those were some of the things that we've loaded. But what is the code that we've written? It's very, very small. This is all I've had to do. I had to write a small little function to import my devices, and then I implemented this endpoint. We call this an endpoint. Each one of these things that there's going to be a route for is going to be referred to as an endpoint, and this is just my function where I import the devices. That's calling this thing up here, and then I just return it. And you can see, isn't this handy? I'm returning a dictionary, a Python dictionary, but what ends up happening is Flask very nicely for me translates that into JSON. And so although this looks like a dictionary, it's actually JSON. So that's what we have so far. That's a quick review. The next thing that we're going to do is talk about how you can store this information into a database. Okay, so let's get started with the coding that we're going to do for this session. But before we do, I want to do a couple of things from a housekeeping point of view. First thing I want to do is this. Here's my Flask, which is running. You'll recall that I had to do this export Flask that you see here before I could actually do my next one, which would be Flask run, which would be to execute it. Now, what I want to do instead is I'm going to put this into my bash shell script that gets run whenever I start up a terminal session. So I'm going to go and edit that. So I'm going to go to my home directory. I'm going to vi.bash rc, which is the file that gets run. You can use whatever editor that you want. I'm going to add a line here that is going to put in my export Flask, and I'm going to save this. Then I'm going to get out. I'm going to exit this window so that when I open up a new terminal window, it will run that. I could have run it from the same window, but now I'm going to go to where I need to be, PyCharm projects, quokka, and I'm going to just do flask run. And hopefully this will run successfully. It looks like it has. Just for grins, let's see if it's actually working. I'm going to send this request again, and sure enough, it's returned the data. Okay, so we've done that piece of housekeeping successfully. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to move this functionality and this functionality out of this init module into the places that I know that they will want to live. So the first thing we'll do is let's work on this one right here. So let's move import devices into some place that makes more sense. Now it seems like it's kind of a utility program. There's a number of places that I could put it. I could consider putting it here in data with the data that it reads in, but I'm trying to protect this data directory to only have data and not have code. So if I put it with models, that would kind of make sense, but most of the model stuff is dealing with the database. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in controller. When I open controller here, I'm going to actually just create a module called util. So I go up here, new Python file. I'm going to call it util. And now I have a new file here called util. I'm going to go here. By the way, let me show you something that's handy about IDEs that I kind of like. If I've got my init over here, I'm going to open up util vertically on the right. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do Control X to get rid of it. And now I'm going to do Control Y to put it in here. Now you've noticed that it's telling me already I've got a problem. It doesn't know about YAML. And you can see over here in init, YAML has been grayed out. That's because it's no longer necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that from there. And I'm going to put it right there. All right, and let me clean this up over here. Now I have this function that I've removed import devices from. We're going to fix that up in a minute. And I have what looks to be an okay representation of our import devices right there. PyCharm is squawking at me because I'm not following the PEP rules for blank spaces, etc. Now I do. Okay, so we've got this set correctly here. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to do this one step at a time. I'm going to fix this import devices in this file. So we're going to just do import devices first. So what I need to do is I need to tell Python where is import devices. Remember before it was in the local module here, underscore init, but we've moved it someplace else. So we need to tell Python, or actually both Python in the long run and PyCharm in the short run, where it is. So I'm going to say from quokka. So from quokka dot, this nicely helps me. I remember I put it in controller dot, and there's my file util import, and the thing that I'm going to import is import devices. And now this seems to be okay. So I've got my devices REST endpoint that's going to first call import devices. Import devices, remember, is over here in util. Let me get the project structure back up so that you can see this. Up here in controller in the util file is where my import devices is. And so we are going to reference that right here. This is referencing the package, the module quokka controller util, and access the function import devices. So this looks okay. Let's see if it actually runs. Okay, so that looks okay so far. It is actually running. This is where I said run, and it seems to be giving me the information that it's running okay. I guess we can check that out by running our postman and run this test and see if it's okay. So I'm going to say send. It's going to be doing the import devices, and sure enough, it looks like everything is okay. So it looks like that was successful. Let's review what we have here. What we have is that we moved out of init, we removed import devices, and we put it where we think we're going to want to have it belong in the long run. Now, if you're thinking about just building something yourself from scratch, you can leave everything in init, or you can create something at the same level as init, or however you want to do it. I'm only building it this way because for larger projects, you kind of want to have things organized into packages like we have: controller, data, models, and views. And because I know I'm going to be adding stuff in the future that will make init get pretty congested. So the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to move these view code out of underscore init. One thing that we could do is we could have a file called views, and that's what I did when I initially started with my Quokka project. But then it got big enough, and I decided I needed to actually create a package into which I would put all of my view code. Now I'm going to jump ahead mentally. I want you to remember what happens with Quokka. In fact, why don't I see if I can bring it up right here. I'm going to say, if I can do this correctly, 192.168.254.34, that's my other system. 5,000 is actually where Flask is running, but 3,000 is where my user interface is running. So I'm going to go here, and let's see what happens when I do that. So this looks good so far. So this is running on a different system, okay? Remember, this is not my system. This is running on a different system. And I wanted us to go look here because of the fact that I wanted to remind us of these devices here. Now, these devices are different than the other devices. These first devices, the CSR Sandbox devices and the Nexus Sandbox device, I'm accessing them directly from Quokka out to those devices. On the other hand, I'm pretending that these devices here are SD-WAN devices that are utilizing the internet to communicate with a service that's running in the cloud. And we're trying to do this without private MPLS lines. And so we're using HTTP requests that go from the actual device into our Quokka service. And that means that we're going to have two types of views when we come down here. One of them is going to be views that are coming in and actually going to be accessed by the user interface or by Postman, as we've seen happened here. And the other one are going to be device-based ones that come in from the device into our RESTful API. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new Python file called UI_views. And now I have something called UI views. And remember, what we're attempting to do is we are attempting to take this code right here and move it out of init into this view code. And so I'm going to actually do what I did before. I'm going to split this vertically, and I'm going to take what I've highlighted here, and I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to put it in right here. So now at this point in time, we can see a couple things. Number one, over here, I actually have very little code. I'm not having to worry about anything going on here because I just have the application getting started. This is where Flask gets created and nothing else happens in this particular code here. And the reason is, let's take a step back and just mentally try to process this. When I say Flask run, Flask is going to start up and it's going to run and it's going to just sit there. What's it waiting for? Well, at this point, it's going to be waiting for people to make HTTP requests to us. Now, if we were creating a GUI from here, they could be GUI requests. If we're creating a RESTful API that other pieces of functionality can use, like our user interface or Postman, then we would be building something like this. So this is what we need to do. This over here looks okay, but you notice import devices again is not happy because once again, within UI views, how does Python know where import devices comes from? So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to take this and I'm going to have to delete that from there and I'm going to put it in right here. And you can see that made our import devices happier. But if you're looking closely, you'll see, oh, okay, well, there's this app thing. What is that? Well, if you recall, back in our main init, we have this thing called app. And that is what we created. That's our Flask application. And we need to have reference to that in order for this decorator, this thing right here with the @ sign, means it's a decorator in order for it to get successfully resolved. So the way that we're going to resolve this is we need to have another import statement and we need to tell UI views, hey, in order to resolve app, you need to go back to the main application. So what we're going to say is we're going to say from quokka import app. Let me put in an extra space there. So what this has done is it said, now I want you to go to the package or the module called quokka, and I want you to import app. Now when I hover over this, notice something very important here. Do you see this part on the right? When I import from quokka, this is a weirdness, just the way that Python works. It is actually going to include importing things from underscore underscore init underscore underscore. Now, put this in your mind if you aren't familiar with this. Underscore underscore init underscore underscore is a special thing in Python and it has special meaning and it means different things at different times. But as you may have remembered from the lesson that I have recorded, which you may or may not have listened to, on functions and modules and packages, when you have a package, the way that Python knows that it's a package is it has a file called underscore underscore init in it. And in fact, if we go back to this project listing, you can see that quokka has a file inside it called underscore underscore init. Let me rephrase that. This quokka right here has underscore underscore init as part of it. And so all I need to do is reference quokka and it knows where to find app. And sure enough, it has successfully resolved app. So now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to test this and see if it works. Okay, so it seems like it's working okay. It came up. Normally, if you have errors of some type, if it can't resolve some of the references that you have in your import statements, etc., or if there's just an error and it throws an exception, then you will see something ugly come up here, but this seems to be working okay. Let's go back to Postman and make sure that this is working fine still as well. Okay, so we can see that it did not work. So my job is to figure out why it didn't work. This is 404, which means that the URL doesn't exist, at least not as far as Flask knows. When I go back and look at my Flask code, this is all that Flask knows about at this point in time is the code that's in init.py. And remember, I've gotten rid of everything. I moved this code here out of that module, that init module, and consequently all the REST endpoints that Flask knows about is basically what's here, which is nothing. And so I need to tell Flask, hey, there's these views that I've created and I've put them down here in UI underscore views. I need you to be aware of them. And the way that we make Flask aware of it is with an import statement. So here I'm going to say import quokka.views.ui views. Let's go back and let's stop Flask. And now let's start it again. Now we see that there's a problem. Flask isn't even running correctly. Well, what's going on? It says, while importing quokka, an import error was raised. And it says, import error cannot import name app from partially initialized module quokka. And this is something important to learn about Python in general. You will see this come up time and time again. Circular imports. Basically what happened is this. As Python was beginning to process this, it went down and said, okay, I'm going to quokka.views.uiviews. I want to process it, so it comes down here, processes this statement. Let me make this a little bit bigger. And then it says from quokka import app. Well, it's circular, reaching back into init in order to import app. Well, first of all, app hasn't been created yet. And so what you need to do in situations like this is you need to delay the importing of the views code. And so this is what we're going to do. We're going to delete this from here, and we're going to come down and put my import statement down below. That will allow app to have gotten created at the point that we come down here and Python begins to process quokka.views.uiviews, at which point it's going to try to import app. So let's go back to our window and say, let's try this again. All right, so it seems to be happy. It's run successfully. It hasn't gotten into that circular import. The next test will be to say, okay, let's see if this actually works. And sure enough, here is the data coming back. So let's review what we have done. We have taken what was originally, everything was in init, and we've moved everything out of it. Into util, we moved import devices, and into UI views, which is also over there, we have moved our REST endpoint. So init is nice and clean. I can run my Flask application and it's not cluttered with all this extra stuff, and we should be good to go. The next thing that we'll do is we'll begin to work on the database stuff.